My son Marcus had always been extraordinary, even as a newborn. The nurses at the hospital could not stop smiling when they held him. His cry, though piercing, seemed to demand attention rather than annoy, and every time he laughed, the room felt lighter. Visitors who entered the maternity ward often left with a sense of awe, whispering about how remarkable he was. I remember one nurse shaking her head as she placed him in my arms. "Some babies, they just shine differently. Take care of him. He's special." I held him close, feeling both a surge of love and a tiny flicker of unease. It was hard to describe. A newborn should be fragile and dependent, yes, but Marcus seemed aware of the world even as he closed his tiny fists and yawned. That awareness, almost like a tiny seed of ambition, was something I would notice more as he grew, and something that would shape our lives in ways I could never have predicted. As he grew, Marcus's charm became his natural armor. At 3, he had learned how to say please in a tone that melted hearts, even of strangers who had no obligation to him. By the age of 5, he had perfected the art of getting what he wanted without ever raising his voice. I would often watch in quiet awe, or sometimes in dread, at the way adults around him responded. A gentle pout, a wide-eyed look, and suddenly he had cookies he hadn't earned, or a toy someone else had meant for another child. The grandfather clock arrived that year, on a rainy afternoon when the movers carried it into our house. Its tall, polished mahogany body gleamed under the soft light of the living room. Its pendulum swung like a heartbeat, regular and steady. Marcus, of course, was fascinated. He ran his small fingers over the smooth carvings, pressed his ear to the face, and asked in a voice that was curious but calculating, "Mom, what is this sound?" "It's the sound of time," I said softly, unsure if a 5-year-old could understand what I meant. Robert, my husband, smiled from behind him. "It reminds us that every second counts," he said. But Marcus didn't just listen. He studied the clock. He traced the edges of the wood, memorized the curves, as they were more than just a timekeeper. Perhaps in that moment, he began understanding value, not in abstract or sentimental terms, but in a way that would later shape his ambitions and his expectations. Robert, in those early years, was the silent backbone of our family. He worked long hours, often missing birthdays, school plays, and family dinners, but he never complained. He wanted Marcus to have life easier than we had. "I'm doing this for him," Robert said once, rubbing tired eyes. "He should never have to struggle the way we did." I believed him. I admired him. And yet I began to notice that Marcus was learning something Robert hadn't anticipated. That comfort and admiration could be taken for granted. By the time Marcus was 6, his charm had become a subtle tower. Teachers called him gifted. Neighbors whispered about his intelligence, and friends' parents often compared their children to him. "Why can't they be more like Marcus?" they asked, never realizing how their praise silently taught him he was entitled to admiration. He soaked it in, and I watched, sometimes with pride, sometimes with a quiet apprehension, as he learned the rules of persuasion, of influence, of getting what he wanted without ever demanding it. Marcus's ability to manipulate situations with charm grew in parallel with his personality. A simple misbehavior at school could be spun into an innocent misunderstanding. He could turn arguments to his favor with a smile and a tilt of the head. I noticed that his empathy, though genuine in glimpses, was often a tool rather than a feeling. At times, it frightened me, how easily he could convince adults that his mistakes were not mistakes at all. And yet, as a mother, I found myself excusing him. Perhaps all mothers do that. Perhaps we all believe our children are exceptions to the harsh rules of the world. The clock remained a fixture in our home, a silent witness to Marcus's growing brilliance and increasingly his subtle self-centeredness. He loved it, yes, but not as a keeper of memories or family history. He admired its value, its grandeur, the way people noticed it. He often said, tracing the wood with small fingers, "Mon, one day this will be mine. It's worth a lot." I smiled then, thinking he was simply dreaming. I didn't realize he was learning the art of anticipating inheritance. of recognizing the worth of objects and, by extension, the worth of what people could provide. Robert would sometimes catch me watching Marcus and offer a quiet word of warning. He's learning, yes, but what he's learning isn't always obvious. Sometimes charm can become entitlement. Sometimes ambition can slip into manipulation. Keep your eyes open, love. I would nod, though I didn't always act on it. I was learning too, learning how to love a child who could be both brilliant and frustrating, charming and manipulative, affectionate and demanding. By the time Marcus turned 8, the patterns of his influence were unmistakable. What had once seemed like simple charm had matured into a deliberate, almost strategic way of interacting with the world. I noticed it most at home, though it extended to school, neighbors, and even our extended family. He had learned intuitively that words carried power, timing carried power, and appearances carried power too. He was observing, recording, and responding, and I was beginning to realize that his intelligence was not merely academic, but deeply social, almost instinctual in its ability to bend people to his will. One afternoon, I found him standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by toys, each carefully positioned. It was no longer play, it was orchestration. He had lined up his cars by size, his blocks by shape, and even arranged his small figures as though conducting a council. He noticed me watching, paused, and then offered a small smile, as if to say, "Yes, I see you, and yes, I know what you think." That tiny smile, layered with innocence and subtle command, was something I would recognize in the years ahead. It was his silent declaration that he understood influence already. School became another arena for Marcus's subtle education. He excelled academically, yes, but his social interactions became increasingly calculated. In group activities, he often positioned himself as a leader, not through force, but through suggestion, charm, and subtle guidance. He understood that influence was often more effective than authority, and that a well-timed word or smile could shape outcomes without anyone realizing they had been led. Teachers praised his intelligence and maturity, yet some whispered to each other about his cunning nature. I, of course, could see both sides, the brilliance and the subtle manipulation. But I found myself excusing his behavior with the same justification that many mothers use. He is learning, he is young, he is gifted. By the age of 11, Marcus had developed a subtle but unmistakable sense of entitlement, though it was cloaked in charm and innocence. The world around him seemed to bend to his presence, and people, family, neighbors, even friends' parents, responded almost instinctively to his needs. It was in these small interactions, seemingly trivial at the time, that Marcus began to understand the power of expectation. He learned early that if he asked politely enough, smiled cleverly enough, or timed his requests precisely, the answer would almost always be yes. By the time Marcus turned 28, the lessons of charm, patience, and influence he had practiced since childhood had matured into something formidable. He was confident, ambitious, and utterly certain that the world, including me, would bend to his will. He had grown into the man I had raised with love, patience, and unknowingly, indulgence. And yet, there was a reckoning that neither of us had anticipated. It began with the cruise. Marcus had packed his suitcase in the morning light, his energy radiant and commanding. He had prepared everything meticulously: the tickets, the itinerary, the borrowed credit card he had snatched from my wallet, as if it were his birthright. He smiled at me with that signature charm, the same smile he had perfected since age 5. "Mom," he said lightly, "it's just a loan. You'll be fine. I need this break. I work so hard." I watched him stride through the hallway, suitcase wheels clicking, heart pounding with a mixture of fear, frustration, and a strange sense of liberation. The cupboards were empty. The fridge hummed hollowly. The house seemed to echo with the absence of his presence, a void that reminded me of every sacrifice I had made, every indulgence I had allowed, every lesson of patience and love I had imparted without restraint. And then I looked at the grandfather clock. It stood tall and elegant, its pendulum swinging like a heartbeat. Marcus had always admired it, tracing its carved wood with a reverence that was equal parts curiosity and ambition. "That's mine one day, Mom," he had said countless times. "Family heirloom." That night, I made a decision. I called the auction house early the next morning. The clock, with its polished mahogany and intricate craftsmanship, was appraised and sold. Thousands exchanged hands, enough to fill our cupboards with real food, fresh fruit, fine wine, and comforts I had long denied myself. It was not just a transaction, it was a reclamation. When Marcus returned, tanned and confident, expecting to find his mother groveling or apologetic, he froze. His eyes widened as he stared at the empty space where the clock had once stood. "Mom, how could you? That was for me!" His voice was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and betrayal. I smiled, calm and deliberate, as I poured myself a cup of real coffee. "Darling," I said softly, savoring the warmth in my hands. "I decided to take my own vacation, from waiting for you to appreciate me." Marcus flinched at the words, realizing, perhaps too late, that the lessons he had practiced for decades, charm, negotiation, influence, had not prepared him for this. The balance of power had shifted. The mother who had always bent, sacrificed, and endured had finally stood upright. Time passed, as it always does. Marcus returned months later, hesitant, reflective, seeking not money or indulgence, but perhaps understanding. We sat together in the quiet of the living room, speaking gently, carefully, slowly. He admitted mistakes, acknowledged lessons, and began to learn that charm and strategy, while powerful, cannot replace respect, gratitude, and self-reliance. The grandfather clock was gone, but the lessons it had marked, patience, time, consequence, and self-worth remained. And in that realization, I found peace. Marcus would continue his journey, as would I. But for the first time in my life, I lived on my own time, and that, I decided, was the most valuable inheritance of all.